Children stepped off cattle cars at Auschwitz expecting death, but some faced something far worse. A man in a pristine white coat would smile at them, whistle cheerful tunes, and point his finger left or right. Those who went right died quickly in gas chambers. Those who went left became playthings for a doctor who turned medicine into torture. His name was Josef Mengele, and he transformed the most notorious death camp in history into his personal laboratory. For nearly 2 years, he conducted experiments so twisted that even other SS officers found them disturbing. The worst part? He genuinely believed he was advancing science. Josef Mengele wasn't born a monster. In 1911, he entered the world as the son of a wealthy German industrialist family. His early life showed promise. He earned advanced degrees in medicine and anthropology from respected German universities. By all accounts, he was brilliant, charming, and destined for a successful career in academic medicine. His dissertation focused on genetic abnormalities in jaw development, legitimate research that could have helped countless patients. But Mengele made a choice that would transform him into one of history's most notorious war criminals. In 1937, he joined the Nazi Party, drawn by their promises of racial purity and scientific advancement. The party's pseudo-scientific theories about genetics and racial superiority aligned perfectly with his academic interests. He saw an opportunity to conduct research that would be impossible in the ethical constraints of normal medical practice. The Nazi regime offered ambitious doctors like Mengele something universities couldn't provide: unlimited test subjects and complete freedom from moral boundaries. Traditional medical ethics required patient consent, careful protocols, and respect for human dignity. The Nazi system eliminated these inconveniences, allowing researchers to treat human beings as laboratory equipment. By 1943, Mengele had earned his place in the SS Medical Corps through a combination of academic credentials and ideological commitment. His superiors recognized his potential as both a doctor and a true believer in Nazi racial theory. When they needed someone to oversee medical operations at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mengele was the perfect candidate. The assignment to Auschwitz wasn't a punishment, it was a promotion. The camp offered Mengele access to hundreds of thousands of prisoners from across Europe, representing every genetic variation he could want to study. Unlike university research, where patient availability limited his work, Auschwitz provided an endless supply of test subjects who had no legal protection and no hope of escape. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943 and immediately established himself as different from other SS doctors. While his colleagues treated selections as routine administrative tasks, Mengele approached the arrival platform like a scientist examining specimens. He would scan each transport with the excitement of a researcher who had just received a shipment of laboratory equipment. The selection process was designed to separate prisoners into different categories based on their perceived usefulness to the Nazi war effort. Most doctors made quick decisions: healthy adults to the right for forced labor, everyone else to the left for immediate execution. Mengele turned selections into hunting expeditions for research subjects. He developed an eye for genetic anomalies that other doctors missed completely. Twins, people with different colored eyes, individuals with physical disabilities, and anyone with unusual physical characteristics caught his attention immediately. These prisoners received special treatment that initially seemed like mercy, but was actually something much worse. Witnesses remembered Mengele's disturbing demeanor during selections. While other SS officers maintained professional distance, Mengele smiled constantly and whistled classical music as he decided who would live and who would die. He treated the process like an enjoyable hobby rather than life-and-death decisions affecting thousands of people. His enthusiasm for the work set him apart from colleagues who viewed selections as unpleasant duties. Other SS doctors often delegated selection responsibilities or performed them mechanically. Mengele personally oversaw as many selections as possible because he genuinely enjoyed the process of identifying potential research subjects. The prisoners quickly learned to fear Mengele more than other SS officers. His smile didn't represent kindness. It meant he had identified someone for his experiments. Being selected by Mengele meant surviving the initial selection, but it also meant facing something far worse than quick death in gas chambers. Mengele's obsession with twins stemmed from Nazi theories about heredity and racial characteristics. Twin studies offered the perfect controlled experiment: two individuals with identical genetic backgrounds who could be subjected to different treatments to measure the results. In legitimate medical research, twin studies required careful ethical protocols and limited interventions. At Auschwitz, Mengele had no such constraints. He established a special barracks for twins, separated from other prisoners and given slightly better living conditions. The improved treatment wasn't mercy, it was practical necessity. Mengele needed his test subjects healthy enough to survive long enough for meaningful experimentation. Dead twins couldn't provide useful data. The initial examinations seemed almost benign compared to what followed. Mengele measured every aspect of his subjects' physical characteristics, taking detailed photographs, dental impressions, and fingerprints. He documented eye color, hair texture, body proportions, and any distinguishing marks with scientific precision. The thoroughness of his documentation showed that he genuinely believed his work had scientific value, but the examinations were just the beginning. Mengele designed experiments specifically to test his theories about genetic inheritance and racial characteristics. He injected dyes into children's eyes to see if he could change their color permanently. He performed surgical procedures on one twin while using the other as a control group to measure the effects. The most horrific experiments involved deliberately infecting one twin with diseases while keeping the other healthy to compare their responses. Mengele would inject typhus, tuberculosis, or other deadly pathogens into healthy children just to observe how their genetic makeup affected disease progression. When one twin died from the infection, he often killed the other immediately to perform comparative autopsies. Twin studies weren't limited to children, though they made up the majority of subjects. Adult twins underwent similar experimentation, though their stronger physical conditions sometimes allowed them to survive longer. Mengele seemed particularly interested in pregnant women carrying twins, conducting experiments that involved removing the fetuses at different stages of development. The scientific justification for these experiments was completely false. Mengele believed he could identify genetic markers that would allow the Nazi regime to predict and control human characteristics like intelligence, physical strength, and racial traits. His theories had no basis in legitimate genetics, but the Nazi ideology provided all the justification he needed to continue his work. Mengele's research interests extended far beyond twin studies. He collected individuals with any genetic anomaly that might provide insight into Nazi racial theories. People with heterochromia, different colored eyes, became subjects for experiments designed to understand the genetic basis of eye color. Individuals with dwarfism were studied to determine whether their condition represented racial inferiority. His anthropological background influenced his approach to prisoners from different ethnic groups. Mengele conducted detailed measurements of skull dimensions, facial features, and body proportions, believing he could identify scientific evidence for Nazi claims about racial hierarchy. He photographed prisoners from multiple angles and took precise measurements that he planned to use in academic publications after the war. The Noma outbreak among Roma prisoners in 1943 provided Mengele with another research opportunity. Noma is a devastating bacterial infection that primarily affects malnourished children, causing severe facial tissue destruction. When the outbreak began, Mengele initially provided treatment to affected children, not out of compassion, but to study the disease's progression and potential treatments. His approach to the Noma outbreak revealed the depth of his moral corruption. After documenting the early stages of treatment, Mengele deliberately withdrew medical care to observe the natural progression of the disease. He photographed the deterioration of children's faces and took detailed notes on their suffering, treating their agony as valuable scientific data. When the children finally died from the infection, Mengele preserved their heads in formaldehyde and shipped them to research institutions in Germany. The specimens were intended for academic study, with Mengele planning to publish papers on Noma pathology based on his Auschwitz observations. He genuinely believed this work would enhance his post-war academic career. If you're still watching, make sure to subscribe because what comes next reveals how Mengele's experiments became even more twisted as he gained confidence in his methods and lost any remaining connection to human decency. Mengele established multiple research facilities within Auschwitz to support his expanding experimental program. The main laboratory was located in the medical block, equipped with examination tables, surgical instruments, and specimen preparation areas. Adjacent rooms housed his growing collection of preserved organs, tissue samples, and photographic documentation. The laboratory wasn't designed for healing. It was optimized for data collection through human suffering. Mengele installed specialized equipment for measuring physical characteristics and documenting the results of his experiments. He maintained detailed files on each research subject, complete with photographs showing the progression of various procedures and their effects. Surgical experiments represented some of Mengele's most brutal work. He performed unnecessary operations on healthy prisoners to observe their recovery patterns and pain responses. These procedures served no medical purpose beyond satisfying his curiosity about human physiology under extreme conditions. Subjects were often operated on without anesthesia, not because it wasn't available, but because Mengele wanted to study pain responses. Sterilization experiments targeted both male and female prisoners as part of the Nazi regime's broader eugenics program. Mengele developed various methods for rendering people infertile, testing different chemicals, radiation exposures, and surgical techniques. The goal was to identify cost-effective methods for preventing reproduction among groups the Nazis considered genetically inferior. Blood transfusion experiments involved exchanging blood between prisoners of different ethnic backgrounds. Mengele believed he could identify racial characteristics through blood analysis and potentially transfer traits from one person to another through transfusions. These experiments often resulted in severe infections, blood incompatibility reactions, and death. Psychological experiments explored the limits of human mental endurance under extreme stress. Mengele would subject prisoners to various forms of psychological torture while documenting their mental breakdown patterns. He was particularly interested in how genetic background affected psychological resilience, believing he could identify mental weakness through scientific observation. Miklos Niszli, a Hungarian Jewish doctor, became Mengele's reluctant assistant and later provided crucial testimony about the experiments. Niszli was selected for his medical training and forced to participate in Mengele's research as a condition for his own survival. His detailed accounts provide some of the most reliable documentation of what actually happened in Mengele's laboratories. According to Niszli's testimony, Mengele killed 14 pairs of twins in a single night to perform comparative autopsies. The children were murdered with phenol injections directly to their hearts, a method Mengele preferred because it was quick and left the organs intact for examination. The autopsies were conducted immediately after death to preserve tissue quality for microscopic analysis. Niszli described Mengele's behavior during these mass killings as disturbingly casual. The doctor would chat about his research plans while injecting poison into children's hearts, treating the murders as routine laboratory procedures. He showed no emotional reaction to the children's deaths, viewing them purely as research materials that had served their purpose. The forced participation of other medical professionals like Niszli reveals another layer of Mengele's crimes. He corrupted other doctors by making them complicit in his experiments, using their medical knowledge to improve his techniques while threatening their lives if they refused to cooperate. This created a network of unwilling accomplices who possessed detailed knowledge of his activities. Niszli's testimony also documented Mengele's relationships with German research institutions. The doctor regularly shipped specimens and data to universities and medical schools throughout Germany, treating his Auschwitz work as legitimate academic research. These institutions accepted and used materials obtained through human experimentation, making them complicit in Mengele's crimes. Mengele's experiments were based on Nazi racial theories that had no foundation in legitimate science. The regime promoted beliefs about genetic superiority and inferiority that contradicted established principles of genetics and human biology. However, these false theories provided justification for treating certain groups as subhuman and suitable for experimentation. The concept of racial hierarchy that motivated Mengele's work was scientifically absurd. Human genetic variation doesn't support the racial categories that Nazis used to justify their policies. Modern genetics has definitively proven that racial differences are superficial variations that don't correlate with intelligence, character, or biological superiority. Mengele's twin studies were particularly flawed because he misunderstood fundamental principles of genetics and heredity. His belief that he could identify genetic markers for complex traits like intelligence or personality had no scientific basis. Even if his methods had been ethical, his theoretical framework was so wrong that the experiments couldn't have produced meaningful results. The eugenic theories that informed Mengele's sterilization experiments were equally false. The Nazi belief that they could improve the human race through selective breeding ignored the complexity of human genetics and the ethical problems with treating people like livestock. These theories had been discredited by legitimate scientists long before Mengele began his experiments. Perhaps most disturbing was Mengele's genuine belief that his work represented important scientific advancement. He wasn't just following orders or pursuing personal advancement. He truly believed he was conducting groundbreaking research that would benefit humanity. This self-deception allowed him to rationalize the most horrific acts as necessary sacrifices for scientific progress. Mengele didn't work in isolation. His experiments were supported by a network of German academic and medical institutions that provided funding, equipment, and theoretical guidance for his research. Major universities and research centers actively collaborated with concentration camp experiments, lending scientific credibility to activities that were fundamentally criminal. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics provided theoretical frameworks for Mengele's racial studies. Directors and researchers at the institute corresponded regularly with Mengele, offering suggestions for experiments and requesting specific types of specimens. This collaboration shows that Mengele's crimes were part of a broader institutional effort rather than isolated acts of individual sadism. Medical schools throughout Germany incorporated materials from concentration camp experiments into their teaching programs. Students learned anatomy and pathology using specimens obtained through murder, while professors published research papers based on data collected through human experimentation. The academic medical community became deeply complicit in Nazi war crimes. Pharmaceutical companies also participated in the network by providing experimental drugs and chemicals for testing on prisoners. These companies knew their products were being used in fatal human experiments but continued supplying materials in exchange for data about drug effects. The pursuit of medical knowledge became corrupted by the elimination of ethical constraints. The extent of institutional collaboration reveals that Mengele's experiments weren't aberrations, but part of a systematic effort to weaponize science for genocidal purposes. Hundreds of doctors, researchers, administrators, and students participated in or benefited from research conducted on concentration camp prisoners. As Soviet forces approached Auschwitz in January 1945, Mengele faced the same choice as other SS personnel: surrender and face prosecution, or flee and hope to escape justice. Unlike some colleagues who chose to fight or commit suicide, Mengele immediately began planning his escape. His self-preservation instincts were as strong as his scientific curiosity. Mengele destroyed as much evidence as possible before fleeing Auschwitz. He burned research files, destroyed laboratory equipment, and eliminated witnesses who could testify about his experiments. However, his efforts to cover up his crimes were incomplete. Enough evidence survived to document the scope of his activities. His escape route took him through Germany, where he assumed false identities and relied on networks of Nazi sympathizers for shelter and assistance. The chaos of Germany's collapse provided perfect cover for war criminals seeking to avoid capture. Mengele's education and social connections gave him advantages that helped him stay hidden while authorities searched for him. The journey to South America required careful planning and significant financial resources. Mengele's wealthy family provided funding for his escape, while Catholic organizations unknowingly helped transport him to Argentina along with thousands of other refugees. The Vatican's assistance to war criminals remains a controversial aspect of post-war history. By 1949, Mengele had established himself in Argentina under the false identity of Helmut Gregor. He lived openly in Buenos Aires, working for pharmaceutical companies and maintaining contact with other Nazi fugitives. The Argentine government's protection of war criminals allowed Mengele to build a new life while avoiding prosecution for his crimes. Mengele's decades in South America revealed a man struggling to reconcile his past actions with his desire for a normal life. He married, had children, and attempted to establish legitimate business ventures while constantly looking over his shoulder for Nazi hunters and law enforcement officials. The psychological burden of his crimes manifested in increasingly paranoid behavior as international pressure to capture him intensified. Despite his efforts to blend into South American society, Mengele never fully escaped his past. He maintained contact with other Nazi fugitives and continued to express belief in the racial theories that had motivated his experiments. There's no evidence that he ever felt remorse for his actions or recognized the moral depravity of his work at Auschwitz. The search for Mengele became one of the most intensive manhunts in history. Israeli intelligence services, Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, and law enforcement agencies from multiple countries pursued leads across 3 continents. The publicity surrounding the search made Mengele one of the most recognizable faces of Nazi war crimes. As the manhunt intensified, Mengele moved frequently between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, using different identities and relying on networks of supporters who helped him stay hidden. His ability to evade capture for decades demonstrated both his resourcefulness and the effectiveness of the support systems that protected Nazi war criminals. The psychological effects of constant hiding took their toll on Mengele's mental health. Former associates described him as increasingly isolated, paranoid, and bitter about his circumstances. He complained about being unable to return to Germany or resume his academic career, apparently viewing himself as a victim of political persecution rather than a war criminal avoiding justice. Josef Mengele died on February 7, 1979, while swimming at a beach resort in Brazil. The man who had caused so much suffering experienced a relatively peaceful death, surrounded by friends who knew him as a quiet German expatriate rather than one of history's most notorious war criminals. His death occurred without fanfare, and for several years his identity remained uncertain. The circumstances of Mengele's death reflected the banality that characterized his final decades. He wasn't killed by vengeful survivors or captured in a dramatic confrontation with authorities. Instead, he suffered a stroke while swimming and drowned in shallow water, dying as an elderly man enjoying a vacation rather than facing justice for his crimes. Forensic identification of Mengele's remains required international cooperation and advanced scientific techniques. Dental records, bone measurements, and DNA analysis eventually confirmed his identity, bringing closure to one of the longest-running searches in criminal history. The scientific methods used to identify him were far more rigorous and ethical than anything he had practiced during his career. The delayed confirmation of Mengele's death meant that Nazi hunters and survivors continued searching for him for years after he had already died. This prolonged uncertainty added to the trauma experienced by his victims' families, who never received the satisfaction of seeing him brought to justice. His death represented the end of an era in Nazi war crimes prosecution. Mengele was among the last major figures from the concentration camp system to die without facing trial, marking the failure of the international legal system to deliver complete justice for Holocaust crimes. Mengele's story serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when scientific ambition operates without ethical constraints. His transformation from promising medical student to war criminal demonstrates how quickly moral boundaries can collapse when institutional pressure, ideological extremism, and unlimited power combine to override individual conscience. The institutional collaboration that enabled Mengele's experiments reveals systemic failures that extended far beyond individual criminals. Universities, medical schools, research institutes, and pharmaceutical companies all participated in or benefited from concentration camp experiments, showing how entire professions can become corrupted by authoritarian regimes. Modern medical ethics codes and international human rights laws emerged partly in response to Nazi medical crimes like those committed by Mengele. The Nuremberg Code, established during the war crimes trials, created the foundation for informed consent requirements that govern medical research today. However, these protections require constant vigilance to maintain their effectiveness. Mengele's escape and decades in hiding demonstrate the limitations of post-war justice efforts. The failure to capture him sent a message that war criminals could potentially avoid consequences for their actions if they had sufficient resources and support networks. This precedent continues to influence how modern war criminals plan their activities and escape routes. The ongoing fascination with Mengele in popular culture reflects society's struggle to understand how educated professionals can become monsters. His story appears in countless books, films, and documentaries, often sensationalized in ways that obscure the broader systemic issues that enabled his crimes. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Mengele's legacy isn't what he did at Auschwitz. It's what happened after the war. While other Nazi war criminals faced trial and execution, Mengele lived comfortably in South America for over 3 decades. He married, raised children, and built successful businesses using skills developed through human experimentation. The international community spent millions of dollars searching for him while he swam at beach resorts and attended dinner parties with friends who never suspected his true identity. Even more chilling is what investigators discovered when they finally examined his personal papers after his death. Mengele had continued his anthropological studies throughout his exile, carefully documenting the physical characteristics of indigenous South American populations. He never stopped seeing people as research subjects. Right until the end, he maintained detailed notes about genetic variations and hereditary traits, as if he was still planning to resume his experimental work. And here's the part that should terrify you. In 1985, 6 years after Mengele's death, authorities discovered that he had been working as a consultant for